Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and a saint's shadow held the knife, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Nun's Bloodied Rosary Beads. The rosary was still warm when Father Brown touched it, warm and slick with someone's blood. For a long moment, he simply stared at his own fingertips, as if the crimson stains crawling across them had no right to exist in a chapel. The candles flickered, protesting the draught that had no source, and somewhere in the rafters, a single bead fell from the broken chain, rolling until it stopped at the foot of the altar. That small sound, that hollow tap of glass on stone, echoed like a gunshot through the empty church. He had seen death before, many times, but this was something else entirely. Not just a crime, but a message, the kind that whispers through silence, the kind that makes faith itself tremble. Because the woman who had owned this rosary, the woman now lying cold behind the locked vestry door, wasn't just any sister of mercy. She was Sister Agnes, the convent's most devout, the one who never broke her vows, the one whose hands once healed where doctors failed. And now those same hands had been folded neatly across her chest, as if in prayer, but clutching the very beads that strangled her. The police had come and gone, leaving chalk marks and unanswered questions. Father Brown remained behind, not as an investigator, but as a man compelled, drawn by something he couldn't name. The church air still smelled of incense, but beneath it was something metallic, old, and human. He found himself staring at the altar cloth again. There were faint red streaks there too, almost hidden beneath the lace. He reached out, tracing the shape with a trembling hand, and whispered to no one, "This wasn't done in anger." Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the stained glass windows like 1,000 tiny confessions. Each drop seemed to say something different, something accusing. The sisters of the convent were gathered in the hallway, pale and trembling, their eyes darting toward him as though he carried the devil himself in his pocket. None of them spoke, not even when he passed, not even when he asked. Only one, Sister Bernadette, the youngest, dared to meet his gaze. "Father," she said softly. She died smiling. That single sentence shattered something inside him. Smiling? That detail hadn't been mentioned in the constable's report. He turned to her slowly, as though afraid of what he might see next. "What do you mean?" he asked. Her lips parted, but the words seemed to die on her tongue. Finally, she whispered, "I can't say it here. They'll hear." And then she vanished into the corridor's shadows, leaving him with the echo of her fear. Hours later, he stood alone in the vestry, the lantern's light throwing jagged shapes against the walls. The body had been removed, but its memory remained. He could feel it in the air, heavy, almost tangible. On the table lay a book of Psalms, open to a verse he knew by heart. "Deliver me from blood guilt, O God, thou God of my salvation." The page was torn, the ink smeared, but beneath the verse, written in trembling script, was something that didn't belong. A single word, one that froze his heart cold. Confessio. He sat down slowly, his breath fogging the air. The word itself meant confession, but it wasn't signed. Whose confession? And why write it in blood? As he pondered, the door creaked open behind him. He turned quickly, expecting the constable or perhaps Sister Bernadette, but no one was there, just the corridor, yawning black and endless. Then came the sound. Faint, deliberate footsteps moving away, bare feet on stone. He followed, lantern raised, down the hall, lined with portraits of saints. Each face seemed to turn as he passed, painted eyes glinting in the flicker. He could almost hear their whispers, prayers or warnings. He couldn't tell. The footsteps led him to the bell tower, where the wind whistled through broken panes like a dying choir. At the top, he found nothing but the rope, swinging slowly, and a single drop of blood sliding down its length. The rope's fibers gleamed dark in the lantern light. He reached out, then froze. There was something tied near the top, just beneath the wooden beam. A rosary bead, one that didn't match the nun's set. He climbed, his hands shaking, each rung of the ladder creaking under his weight. When he reached it, the bead came loose easily, almost willingly. It was carved from bone, not wood, not ivory, bone, and engraved with a symbol, a cross, but inverted, marked with a small crown of thorns around it. His pulse quickened. That symbol was not of the church. It belonged to something older, something the church had tried to bury centuries ago. By the time he descended, his lantern flickered violently, the flame dimmed, then died, leaving him in near darkness. Only the faint glow of the stained glass below offered light, a depiction of Saint Veronica wiping the blood from Christ's face. But in that light, the red glass didn't look like art. It looked fresh, wet. He took a step closer, his breath catching in his throat. Someone had smeared real blood across the window's surface. A message, written in shaking lines, "He watches even here." The words burned in his mind. Who was he? A priest? A heretic? Or something worse? He stumbled back, nearly tripping over a fallen candle. It rolled across the floor and stopped at the base of the Virgin Mary's statue. When he picked it up, he noticed something wedged beneath the statue's pedestal, a small scrap of cloth. It was part of a nun's habit, stained, torn, and smelling faintly of iron. Beneath the blood, a faint scent of roses lingered, holy oil mixed with death. He turned it over and froze. Sewn into the edge with silver thread were initials, A.D., not Sister Agnes, not anyone he knew. But the convent's archives had records of every sister who'd ever lived within its walls, and those letters, A.D., belonged to someone long dead. Sister Adeline. She had died in 1893, or so the record said. He felt the walls closing in. The storm outside roared now, lightning flashing through the colored glass, painting the chapel in violent hues. In one brief strike, he thought he saw a figure standing at the end of the aisle, draped in black, head bowed, a rosary dangling from pale fingers. He blinked. She was gone. The echo of soft chanting followed him, though, faint and rhythmic, like a lullaby for the damned. Back in his study, he laid the bone bead beside the bloodied rosary, two relics of faith corrupted. He tried to pray, but couldn't form the words. His eyes fell on a letter lying beneath his Bible. It hadn't been there before. No seal, no address, just a folded page, trembling in the candlelight as though alive. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single line, written in the same trembling hand that had written Confessio. The wrong saint was buried here. His throat tightened. The convent had been built over the ruins of an older chapel. He remembered that much. The old grounds had been reconsecrated, the crypt sealed decades ago. But what if the sealing wasn't holy? What if it was meant to keep something in? He pushed away from his desk, his heart pounding, and stared at the walls. Somewhere behind them, faintly, he could hear a sound like fingernails scraping wood. He returned to the chapel before dawn. The storm had passed, but fog hung low like smoke. The pews glistened with moisture. The altar had been cleaned, or someone had tried to clean it. Only faint smears of red remained. Yet, on the far side of the altar, the floorboards looked disturbed, moved. He knelt, pressing a hand to the seams. Fresh dust, faint warmth. He pulled one loose, and the air that escaped smelled of iron and myrrh. A hidden compartment? No, a passage. The lantern light spilled into the gap, illuminating stone steps leading downward. The old crypt. He hesitated only a moment before descending. The air grew colder, heavier. Moisture dripped from the ceiling in slow, steady beats, like the ticking of some morbid clock. When he reached the bottom, the light caught the outlines of coffins, 6 of them stacked in stone alcoves, but only 5 bore names. The 6th was blank. No inscription, no cross, only the faint carving of a crown of thorns, the same symbol as on the bone bead. He set the lantern down and brushed the dust away. Beneath the grime, he found a single carved word: silentium, silence. As he leaned closer, the flame wavered. Something inside the coffin shifted, softly, like fabric against wood. He stumbled back, nearly toppling the lantern. It didn't stop moving. The sound came again. A scrape, a thud, then silence once more. He stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest. A chill crawled up his spine as he realized the coffin's lid wasn't sealed. It was nailed shut from the inside. His hand trembled toward the hammer on the nearby shelf, but before he could touch it, a voice spoke behind him. Calm, feminine, whispering, "Father, do not open it. Not again." He turned, slowly, deliberately, but no one was there. Only shadows and old bones. The whisper came again, this time closer. "We warned her. We all did." His pulse thundered in his ears. "Who?" he managed to whisper. Silence answered him. Then the faint clatter of rosary beads, as if dropped onto stone. He spun around, but the sound seemed to come from every direction at once. He ran, back through the tunnel, up the stairs, slamming the hatch behind him. The chapel was darker now, the fog pressing against the stained glass, turning saints into ghosts. He sank into the nearest pew, clutching his rosary, whispering prayers that felt hollow. When he opened his eyes, there it was again, the single bead from the tower, lying beside him on the bench. Only now, the symbol on it had changed. The inverted cross was gone. In its place, carved deep and fresh, were 2 letters: BF. His breath caught. His own initials, Father Brown. He stared at it for a long time, as if by sheer will he could make it disappear. But it remained, gleaming faintly in the light that had no source. He felt his pulse hammering through his skull. Someone, or something, had left it for him, not as a warning, as a claim. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the rectory felt like a footstep. Every gust of wind whispered his name. He found himself thinking about Sister Agnes's smile, the peace on her face, the way the rosary had been wrapped around her hands, not in violence, but in reverence, as if she had chosen it, as if she knew what was coming. When dawn finally came, he rose, weary but resolved. He had to know. He returned to the convent, where the sisters were already gathered for morning prayer. Their voices rose and fell, in haunting unison, the Latin verses twisting through the candlelight. But one voice, low, almost inaudible, carried beneath the rest, humming something different. a melody not of worship, but of lament. He followed the sound to the back of the chapel, where Sister Bernadette stood alone, her eyes closed, her lips moving without words. "Child," he said softly. She didn't open her eyes. "You've heard it too, haven't you?" he asked. She nodded once. "Since the night she died." He waited. "What did you mean when you said she died smiling?" Her eyes opened then, wide, terrified. "Because she wasn't alone," she whispered. "Someone was praying with her." "Who?" She looked toward the altar. "You were, Father. At least, she thought it was you." The world seemed to tilt. He stepped back, the blood draining from his face. "That's not possible," he whispered. "I wasn't here." Sister Bernadette's lips trembled, but she said your voice was calling her name. The chapel fell silent. The candles flickered once and went out. In that darkness, Father Brown felt something cold and small press into his palm. He raised his hand slowly. A single rosary bead rested there, bone white, wet, and carved with words so faint he could barely read them. But he did. "Forgive me, Father, for what I must do next." The bead slipped from his fingers and fell to the floor, rolling in slow, perfect circles until it stopped at the base of the altar. He didn't move. Couldn't. Because in the echo of that tiny sound, he finally understood the terrible truth. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. And somewhere beneath the chapel floor, something began to whisper his name again. Chapter 2. Father Brown's shadow saw everything. The shadow moved before he did. That was the first thing that shouldn't have been possible. It slid along the chapel wall long before Father Brown entered, as if his shape, his very presence, had arrived ahead of him to witness what his eyes had not yet seen. The morning light slanted through the cracked window, spilling across the pews and the blood-stained floorboards that no one had managed to clean since Sister Agnes's death. And there, in the half-light, his shadow leaned over the altar, long, distorted, but unmistakably his, reaching out to touch the same place where the blood had pooled a week ago. For a moment, he thought the exhaustion was playing tricks on him. He hadn't slept properly since that night in the crypt. The whispering still came sometimes when the candles burned too low, soft, measured, familiar. But as he stood there now, frozen in the doorway, he realized that the shadow's hand didn't match his. His arm was still at his side. The shadow's wasn't. He took one step forward. The shadow didn't move. And that was when the whisper began again. Not a voice exactly, not sound. More like an echo pressed against the inside of his skull. A thought that wasn't his own. It said his name the way a confessor might, low and deliberate, each syllable dragging across the soul like a dull knife. He blinked rapidly, but the voice did not fade. Instead, it grew clearer, more urgent. You saw it. The words chilled him to the bone. Because he hadn't. Not truly. He had been there, yes, but he had arrived after the fact. The police report confirmed it. The witnesses confirmed it. His own memory confirmed it. He hadn't seen Sister Agnes die. And yet the shadow, his own distorted likeness now etched on the wall, seemed to disagree. He turned, searching the chapel for movement. The air was still. The morning bells hadn't yet rung, but when he looked back at the wall, the shadow was gone. He stepped closer to the altar, his shoes echoing faintly across the floor. He knelt, tracing his fingers along the grooves of the wood where the blood had dried in tiny, almost perfect arcs. And beneath it, hidden in the cracks, was something dark, something that hadn't been there before. He pried it free, a small shard of glass, tinted red by the morning light. A fragment from the chapel window, perhaps, but when he held it up, he saw the faintest trace of an image engraved within. A face, a woman's face, eyes closed, mouth open, as though mid-prayer or mid-scream. He dropped it immediately. The shard clinked against the stone and shattered into dust. But the image stayed with him, because it wasn't Sister Agnes, it was someone else entirely. He stood up, heart pounding. "Who are you?" he whispered. No one answered, only the slow creak of wood as the old pews seemed to shift in the silence. The light changed slightly then, as clouds passed over the sun, and for a brief second, his own shadow fell once more across the floor. But this time, it wasn't alone. Another stood beside it, a taller figure, head bowed, hands clasped behind its back. He spun around, but the chapel was empty. When he looked again, both shadows were gone. By the time he reached the rectory, his hands wouldn't stop trembling. He poured himself tea, but even the cup rattled on its saucer. The ticking of the clock was unbearable, like a pulse mocking him. He sat by the window, watching the grey mist roll through Kembleford, thinking of the symbol carved into the bone bead, the inverted cross that had vanished, and the initials that replaced it, his own. Someone wanted him to believe he was part of this. But why? The knock on the door startled him. It was Inspector Mallory, hat dripping from the rain. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Father," he said gruffly. Father Brown smiled faintly. "I believe I may have." Mallory grunted. "That makes two of us. Another one's dead." The words landed like a hammer. "Another?" The inspector nodded. "Sister Bernadette, found in the bell tower this morning, same as before." Father Brown closed his eyes. The youngest. The one who had spoken of smiles and shadows. He followed Mallory back to the convent, though the rain made the roads slick and the sky too dark for morning. The bell tower loomed ahead, like a tooth against the clouds. Inside, the air was colder than outside. The smell hit first, iron and damp stone. And there she was, laid gently at the base of the tower steps. No struggle, no sign of violence, save for the mark on her neck. A thin red line. A rosary again, twisted and broken. But it was the walls that stopped. Him cold. They were covered in handprints. Faint, smudged, as though someone had pressed their palms against the stone, again and again, in desperation. But all the prints were on the inside, reaching outward. He moved closer. Mallory watched him carefully. "You know what this means, don't you, Father?" "Yes," Father Brown murmured, "but it isn't what it seems." He crouched by the body. Something glinted in her hand, a fragment of mirror glass, slick with rain. He pried it loose, and there it was again, the same faint engraving of a woman's face. But this time, the eyes were open, and they were looking directly at him. He dropped the shard, and it shattered against the stone. "Where did you find her?" he asked. Mallory frowned. "In the tower, like I said. Why?" "Because these handprints—" He touched the wall, and his skin went cold. The prints were damp, fresh. "They're not hers." The inspector's brow furrowed. "Then whose are they?" Father Brown didn't answer, because in that moment, his eyes had caught something else, something impossible. Near the highest beam of the tower, half hidden by shadow, was a smear of light shaped like a cross, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable, hung another silhouette. It was his own. When he blinked, it was gone. That night, he dreamed of the chapel again, of the rosary beads rolling across the floor, of Sister Agnes's smile. But in this dream, someone else was there, standing behind him, whispering his prayers back to him word for word, their voice perfectly mimicking his own. He woke with a start. sweat slick on his skin. The candle beside his bed had burned down to waxy puddles, but there, in the melted mess, was something solid, a small piece of glass, perfectly clean, reflecting the faint light. His own face stared back at him, but it wasn't moving. He pushed out of bed, heart racing, and stumbled to the window. The courtyard outside was empty, silent save for the low hum of the storm beginning again. But just before lightning split the sky, he saw it. The figure standing by the chapel door, wearing his coat, his hat, his very posture. And then the lightning struck, and the figure vanished. The next day, the convent refused to let him inside. The sisters locked the chapel and sealed the tower, muttering about curses and visitations. But that night, as he knelt in his study to pray, the door opened without a sound. The candlelight flickered, elongating the shadows across the wall. One of them was his, the other wasn't. It moved first. Slowly, carefully, it raised its hand and pointed toward the desk. He followed the gesture. There, lying where he had left his Bible, was another letter. No seal, no name. Just a thin fold of yellowed paper, faintly wet at the edges. He opened it, and inside were only 5 words. You saw her kill herself. His pulse stopped. He stared at the words, unblinking. They were written in red ink. Or was it blood? The letters were uneven, trembling. Whoever had written them had been afraid. But it wasn't the message that chilled him most. It was the handwriting. It was his own. He dropped the letter and stumbled backward, knocking over the candle. Darkness swallowed the room. He reached for the door, but his hand hit the wall instead. Rough stone, not wood. The air smelled different now, cold, wet. He turned slowly. The study was gone. He was back in the chapel. The candlelight flickered to life somewhere behind him. He turned and saw the altar once more, draped in white linen. The broken rosary beads had been neatly arranged atop it in the shape of a cross, and beside them lay a mirror. Not the small kind for vanity. This one was large, framed in silver, the sort you'd find in a confessional chamber. Something moved within it. He stepped closer, his shoes crunching against scattered beads. His reflection stared back, but the eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep. They seemed to stretch beyond the glass, pulling at the edges of the world. Then the reflection smiled, slow and deliberate. He didn't. "Who are you?" he whispered. The reflection's mouth moved, but the voice came from behind him. "You are." He spun around, and the mirror cracked violently down the middle. A shard fell to the floor, slicing open his hand. Blood dripped onto the wood, but where the drops landed, they spread outward, forming words, glistening and red. She didn't die alone. The message pulsed faintly, then began to fade. He clutched his hand, pressing it to his chest. Behind him, the cracked mirror began to hum, a low vibration like a held note. When he dared to look again, the reflection was gone, but his shadow remained, still visible inside the glass, frozen mid-prayer. He backed away slowly, his breath ragged. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself. "It's fatigue. It's guilt. It's—" The voice interrupted him again, soft, almost kind. "It's memory." The next morning, Mallory arrived with another report. The convent had burned, the tower struck by lightning, the chapel consumed. No survivors among the sisters, only ashes and twisted metal where the bell once hung. Father Brown listened in silence. When the inspector asked if he wanted to see it, he shook his head. "No," he said, "I already have." Later that day, as he packed to leave Kembleford, he found the bloodied handkerchief he'd used to bind his cut. Wrapped inside it was another rosary bead, smooth, polished, but darker now. He rolled it between his fingers and felt something carved into its surface. He held it to the light and read the inscription. The shadow remembers everything. He felt the world tilt again, the edges of reason slipping away. He looked toward the window and froze. For just a second, reflected in the glass, stood his own shape, darker, taller, unmoving. And this time, when he turned, it didn't vanish. It smiled. The candle beside him flickered out, plunging the room into complete darkness. There was only the sound of his heartbeat and a faint whisper that felt too close to be air. "You saw her," the voice murmured, "but she saw you first." He reached for his crucifix, but his hand met another hand instead, cold, solid, mirroring his every motion. It pressed the cross back against his chest gently, almost reverently. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The voice spoke again, softer now, almost pitying. "She forgave you." The hand withdrew. The sound faded. The air grew still. When light finally returned, he was alone again. But carved into the wall, just above the place where his shadow still lingered, were 5 words scratched deep into the plaster. Father Brown's shadow saw everything. He stared at the inscription for a long time, unable to move. Because deep down, in the quiet part of his mind, where truth hides from faith, he knew one thing beyond doubt. The shadow wasn't his anymore. And as the bells of the ruined convent tolled once, faint and hollow, Father Brown whispered into the empty air, half prayer, half confession. "I know who did it," he said softly, "but the truth will never be told." The wind answered him with silence, and somewhere behind the wall, a shadow moved again. Chapter 3. The Confession That Killed Him. He died before the priest could even give him absolution, mouth open, words still forming. But it wasn't the poison or the knife that stopped his heart. It was what he said, and what he saw in the mirror behind the confessional curtain. Father Brown had heard thousands of confessions in his time, whispers of sin, echoes of guilt. But nothing had ever chilled him the way that final whisper did. The man, a banker named Thaddeus Crane, respectable, dull, the sort who tithed regularly and wore shame like a tie, had come just past midnight. Rain clung to his coat. He smelled of cheap gin and fresh ink, and he was shaking, not with fear, with something worse, relief, as if he believed confessing would save him. But what he confessed wasn't a crime. It was a memory, a thing he claimed he didn't do. "I didn't kill her," Thaddeus had said, voice hoarse, "but I let her die, and I wrote it down." Father Brown had remained silent, as priests must. But something about that phrasing, it didn't sit right. Wrote it down? Who wrote down a death? And then Thaddeus said the name. Not Sister Agnes, not Sister Bernadette. He said Father Brown's own mother's name. The silence that followed was so absolute, it felt like the chapel had stopped breathing. Thaddeus shifted behind the curtain. "You weren't supposed to know," he whispered, "but I saw her there. I heard what she said. I still hear it, every night." Father Brown wanted to speak, to demand explanation, but that would break the seal. He waited. His hand tightened over his rosary. Thaddeus drew a shuddering breath. "I've kept the letter, hidden it. Every time someone gets close to it, something bad happens. Always. The archivist went blind. The gravedigger vanished. I burned it once, but it came back." Father Brown leaned slightly forward, his pulse rising. "Where is it now?" Thaddeus didn't answer. A soft thud followed. When the priest pushed open the confessional door, Thaddeus was slumped forward, blood trickling from his nose, pupils blown wide. Dead. Not from poison, not from violence, no wound, no trauma, only the look on his face, terror frozen in time. And beside him, on the floor, a small black envelope, sealed in wax. Father Brown picked it up with gloved hands. The seal bore no crest, no initials, just a single perfect indentation. A thumbprint, not his own, and cold. He opened it. Inside, only one line. She forgave me, but you won't. That was 4 days ago. Since then, the world has started to come undone. The rain hasn't stopped. The bells toll at strange hours. And someone has been leaving candles lit inside the crypt, though no one has had a key in years. The letter disappeared the night Thaddeus died, taken from the rectory drawer where Father Brown had placed it. But the wax seal remained, flattened against his desk, like an accusation. And then came the whispers, first in the chapel, then in his room. Finally, last night, in his ear. You already know what you saw, but he didn't. Not truly. That was the worst part. The doubt. Because he had no memory of his mother's death. Only the scent of smoke, the image of an overturned candle, and a voice, always a voice, humming something that wasn't quite a hymn. The convent had buried those secrets. The church had moved on. But now, someone, or something, was digging them back up. Yesterday, a woman came to the parish, dressed in mourning black, gloves, hat. Pale lips, like frost, had kissed them. I was told, she said, that you were the last one to see Thaddeus Crane alive. Father Brown nodded slowly. He was my brother, she said. He told me something would happen, that something was waiting for him in the chapel, something in the confessional mirror. Father Brown felt the room tilt. There is no mirror in that confessional, he said quietly. The woman blinked once. Exactly. She left without another word. That night, he entered the confessional again, lit a candle, sat in silence, and turned to face the wall where a mirror might once have been, and saw himself, only not himself. The figure in the glass wore his collar, his cross, his face. But the eyes were wrong. They were weeping blood, and the lips moved. I heard her too. He woke on the chapel floor, the candle still burning. The next morning, the door to the crypt stood open. He descended. The air was thick with rot and incense. There, on the central slab, rested a new envelope, white, impossibly clean. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a photograph, his mother, standing in the garden, smiling. Behind her, in shadow, was a figure, blurred, distorted, but it wore a priest's cassock, his cassock. The photo was dated 2 years after her death. He stumbled back, heart pounding, breath shallow. The light in the crypt dimmed suddenly, and from the farthest corner, something shifted. A scraping sound, then a whisper. Read the rest. He turned the photo over. Words written in trembling ink. The confession wasn't hers. That night he sat in the chapel, long after the others had gone. He listened to the creak of the pews, the sigh of the wind. And again, the whisper. This time, closer. A shape moved along the far wall, his shadow. But it wasn't mimicking him. It was gesturing, pointing toward the altar. He rose, followed. Behind the altar cloth, beneath the stone slab, something clicked. A hidden compartment. Inside, a single black-bound volume. No title, no markings. He opened it. The first page, a list of names, all crossed out, all dead, including his own. Next to each, a sin, a confession, not made, not forgiven, forced, extracted, and beside them, a date. Each one marked the day they died. He turned to the last page. It was blank, until words began to write themselves. You confessed a lie. His breath caught. The candle beside him flickered, and behind him a voice spoke, not a whisper, not a hallucination, but real and familiar. You buried the truth with her, but truth doesn't stay buried. He turned, but there was no one, only the mirror, now back on the wall, and the face in it, smiling. Not his, but wearing his collar, and holding a rosary, beads made of teeth. He dropped the book, ran, but the church doors wouldn't open. He turned back toward the altar, and saw his own body slumped in the confessional, eyes open, mouth mid-sentence. The final confession never spoken, and the figure in the mirror mouthing the words he could not say. I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Because sometimes confession doesn't set you free. It buries you and writes your name on the next page. Chapter 4, A Saint's Mask Hid Murder. They found the saint's face lying in the mud, not a relic, not a carving, a face, real, preserved, and impossibly clean, as if it had never belonged to anyone mortal at all. Father Brown had been called many things in his life: priest, detective, heretic, but never afraid. Yet when he saw that face, so serene beneath the rain, its eyelids half closed, as though still whispering a blessing, he felt something coil inside his chest that had nothing to do with faith. It wasn't fear of death, it was fear of the divine, because whoever had worn that face hadn't been pretending to be a saint. They had convinced the world that they were one. It began 3 nights ago, when the church unveiled the restored statue of Saint Aurelia, the patron saint of forgiveness and sacrifice. Her marble likeness stood at the front of Kembleford Cathedral, bathed in soft light, her hands forever extended toward heaven. People said her eyes looked too real. They said her lips curved differently each time they prayed before her. Father Brown had dismissed it as pious imagination, until the night the statue began to bleed. At first, it was a single drop, red as wine, sliding down her cheek. The parishioners thought it a miracle. Then the second drop fell, landing on the altar with a soft pat that sounded like a heartbeat. And when the morning sun rose, the statue's head was gone. The bishop called for silence, the nuns locked the doors, but rumors have longer wings than angels. By dawn, the town was filled with whispers. The saint had come alive. Others said it was vengeance, divine or otherwise. Only Father Brown noticed the footprints, small, human, and leading away from the altar. Bare feet. That evening, they found the head, if it could still be called that, half buried behind the convent garden. A perfect mask, peeled from something that once had flesh. A face of impossible craftsmanship and cold beauty, lashes still wet. Inside, the surface was lined with red wax, shaped to fit another's features. Whoever wore it had done so for more than a moment. The doctor called it madness. The inspector called it desecration. Father Brown called it deliberate. He stood alone in the chapel that night, studying the pedestal where the saint had once stood. The air was thick with wax and incense. The wind outside made the candles gutter, their flames bowing as if in mourning. Beneath the marble base, faint scratches etched into the floor caught his eye. He crouched, tracing them with one finger. Latin, words chiseled in haste. Non omnis sanctus luceat. Not every saint shines. The phrase gnawed at him because it wasn't a warning, it was a confession. He went to the bishop's study, demanding the restoration records. The bishop hesitated. "Father, there's something you should understand," he said, his voice quivering beneath his robes. "The sculptor who worked on Saint Aurelia died before finishing the face. He said it, spoke to him, said it wept when he prayed. The rest of us thought it poetic madness, but when he died, his apprentice finished it, a girl from the convent. A nun? Father Brown asked. The bishop nodded. Sister Miriam. The name sent a chill through him. Sister Miriam had been buried 5 years ago. After she'd confessed to sins no one dared record. He'd attended that funeral, watched her coffin lowered. He left without another word, the rain swallowing his footsteps. The convent gates loomed ahead, iron curling like ribs against the fog. Inside, the corridors were silent, too silent. He could hear his own breath echoing against the stone. He reached Sister Miriam's old cell and pushed the door open. The scent of wax and rose oil struck him at once. Her bed remained made, her Bible untouched. But the wall behind the crucifix was cracked, just enough to hide something. He pressed his hand against it. The plaster gave way. Behind it, a hollow. Inside, wrapped in linen, was another mask, smaller, unfinished. Its surface still wet with varnish. Beneath it, a journal, its pages swollen with damp, the ink bleeding into the paper like veins. He opened it. To carve a saint, one must first know sin. Page after page, the same handwriting spiraled into madness. Confessions that weren't her own, voices she claimed had guided her hands, faces she claimed to see when she prayed. And the last entry, written the day before her death, simply said, "He wears her now." Father Brown closed the book, his hands trembling. The wax candle flickered beside him, throwing the shadow of the mask against the wall. And for a second, he swore. The shadow smiled. He returned to the church, journal in hand, intent on telling Mallory everything. But as he crossed the nave, he stopped. The statue's pedestal was no longer empty. Something stood there, something shaped like a saint, but breathing. The figure's eyes were closed. Its skin glowed faintly beneath the candlelight. A whisper filled the air, low and rhythmic. "Forgive us. Forgive us." "Who's there?" he demanded. The eyes opened. They were blue, human, familiar. "Forgive us," the voice repeated. The face was that of Sister Miriam. He stumbled backward, his heart racing. The figure stepped down from the pedestal, moving with slow, deliberate grace. The mask cracked slightly at the jaw as it smiled. "You finished her," Father Brown whispered. "I perfected her," it replied. The voice was not Miriam's, nor was it the sculptor's. It was something between, emerging, as if both spoke from one mouth. He backed toward the door, but the air itself seemed to press against him, heavy and cold. The candles flared, throwing shadows that no longer matched their owners. One of them lingered on the wall, watching. "You think sin hides behind ugliness," the voice said, "but holiness wears a prettier face." Then the mask split fully, falling to the floor. Beneath it, nothing. Only blood, old and black. The figure crumbled like wax in heat, collapsing silently into a heap. He stared at what remained, a rosary, half melted, and a single tooth embedded in the wax. When Mallory arrived minutes later, there was nothing left but the broken marble base. "Another miracle?" the inspector asked bitterly. Father Brown didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the statue's niche. Someone had carved a new line beneath the Latin inscription. It hadn't been there before. "Behold, I am remade." That night he locked the chapel doors. Tried to pray, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the mask, the way it seemed to move even after it fell, the way its eyes, those impossibly real eyes, had looked straight at him. Near dawn, he awoke to the sound of something scraping against the window. He rose, lit his lamp, and froze. The mask was hanging outside on the iron bars. He threw the window open, heart pounding. But the courtyard below was empty, only fog and moonlight. The mask was gone. When he turned back, it was waiting on his desk. He stared at it for hours. It was warm to the touch, softer now, like skin. He could see the faint impression of lips, slightly parted as though ready to speak. Against every instinct, he pressed his ear to it. At first, nothing. Then, breath. Slow, deliberate, and a whisper. "You saw her." He dropped it, stumbling back. The mask hit the floor and cracked down the middle. From inside, spilled a folded scrap of parchment. He unrolled it with trembling fingers. It was a confession, signed by no one. "I killed the sculptor because he would not stop carving her face. I carved her smile to hide my own. And now she wears me." Father Brown stared until the words blurred. The ink shimmered faintly, as if still wet. Then, before his eyes, the signature began to form, letter by letter. Sister Miriam. He felt the air grow colder, heavier. The candles dimmed one by one, until only one remained, burning blue. And in that faint light, he saw it, his reflection on the wall. Except it wasn't his. It wore the mask. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He reached for the crucifix, but the reflection moved first. Its hand rose, mirroring his, but slower. It pressed the cross to its own lips and smiled. The light went out. When dawn came, the chapel was empty again. The mask lay shattered beside the altar, but on the wall where his shadow should have been, a faint image remained, etched in ash and candle smoke. A face, not his, not hers, something between. Later, Mallory would ask him what he'd seen. Father Brown would only say one thing, voice low and trembling. "She wasn't trying to make a saint," he whispered. "She was trying to trap one." Mallory frowned. "Trap? What do you mean?" But Father Brown only looked toward the altar, where the sun now caught the broken marble and made it gleam. For a second, it looked like the face of Saint Aurelia again, gentle, radiant, and human. He turned away, whispering to himself. "I know who did it," he said quietly, "but the truth will never be told." And behind him, just beneath the morning bells, came a sound so soft it could have been imagination. The faint, unmistakable crackle of marble shifting, of something waking beneath its surface, followed by a single whisper that froze his blood where he stood. "Forgive us." Chapter 5. Who whispered before she died? She died with a smile, and someone else's voice in her mouth. The doctor swore. It was the final flicker of air, a body releasing its last breath. But Father Brown had heard enough dying confessions to know the difference between a breath and a word. And when Sister Evangeline fell dead on the chapel floor, the voice that escaped her wasn't hers. It was deeper, older, and it whispered a name that froze the candle flames mid-flicker. His name. For hours after, the church remained in eerie stillness. The other sisters refused to speak, crossing themselves whenever anyone mentioned the sound. Even the bells seemed reluctant to toll for her. The doctor said, "Heart failure." The inspector said, "Exhaustion." But Father Brown stood beside her body and stared at her lips, still parted, as though waiting to speak again, and knew neither man was right, because no mortal whisper could carry that much intent. It began the night before. The storm had returned, crawling over Kembleford like something alive. The convent windows rattled in their frames. The air reeked of damp wood and old stone. And in the center of it all, Sister Evangeline had been praying, alone, long after matins, long after even the faithful had gone to bed. She had been heard murmuring a single name, over and over, Aurelia, the same saint whose mask had been found cracked and bloodied only weeks before. By dawn, she was dead. Father Brown had arrived before the constable. The rain was still falling, washing the last of the candle wax from the altar. Her body was slumped beside the pews, hands clasped around a rosary that wasn't hers. The beads were black, made of polished bone. When he touched them, he felt the faintest pulse, as if something within still lived. He knelt, whispered the rites, but even as he prayed, he thought he heard another voice answering his words, a whisper that didn't belong in any liturgy. She isn't finished. The air grew colder. The windows groaned. Somewhere beyond the nave, a door slammed. He rose, following the echo. It led him toward the vestry, where the candles had been extinguished, but the mirror on the far wall gleamed with faint light. When he stepped closer, he saw her reflection there. Not her body, her reflection. Standing upright, head bowed, eyes open, and moving. The whisper came again, curling through the silence like smoke. You heard it too. He stumbled back, heart pounding. His reflection in the mirror didn't move with him. It stayed, lips twitching. What did she say? He whispered. The reflection smiled. Your name. The glass shattered. He woke hours later in the rectory, the constable shaking his shoulder. You fainted, Mallory said gruffly, though his own face was pale. I'd say exhaustion, but... He trailed off, staring at the small cut along Father Brown's palm. Embedded in the skin was a shard of black glass. What happened to her? Father Brown asked. Mallory hesitated. That's the strange part. The doctor said her throat was burned from the inside, like she swallowed fire. The priest looked down at his hand. The shard glimmered faintly, almost pulsing. He felt the echo of that whisper again. Distant, now, but present. You were there. The rest of the day passed in a blur of questions, statements, and disbelief. But by nightfall, Father Brown was back in the chapel. The floor had been cleaned, the candles replaced, yet the space where she had fallen still smelled of scorched air. He knelt, touching the stone. Warm, as though the fire still lingered beneath. He heard footsteps behind him. Sister Magdalene approached, clutching her habit tight. Father, she whispered, you shouldn't be here alone. He studied her face, pale, drawn, sleepless. You were close to her. She nodded. She told me something strange the night before. What did she say? She said she didn't fear dying anymore because she'd already heard heaven's voice. Father Brown's brow furrowed. Heavens? Sister Magdalene hesitated. She said it wasn't above. It was inside. The candles trembled then, flickering violently, though no wind touched them. The flame nearest the altar split into two tongues, twisting like serpents. Sister Magdalene gasped and crossed herself. Do you hear that? She whispered. He did. The faintest echo, soft but deliberate, whispering from beneath the floorboards, words he couldn't make out. Where was she found exactly? He asked. There, she pointed. Between the pews. He pressed his ear to the floor. The whisper stopped. Then a sound, faint, rhythmic, knocking, like a heartbeat made of wood. He lifted the board. Beneath it, wrapped in linen, was another rosary. But this one was incomplete. Only half the beads remained, strung together by what looked like strands of hair. He touched one bead. A woman screamed, not in memory, not imagination, a real shattering cry that echoed through the entire chapel. He dropped the rosary and stumbled back. The sound cut off as suddenly as it began. Sister Magdalene clutched his arm. It was her, she said. It was Evangeline? He shook his head. No, it wasn't. She stared. Then who? He didn't answer. because he wasn't sure. That night, sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, calm, serene, smiling. And then her mouth opened, and his name came out again, soft and pleading. He woke drenched in sweat, the rosary bead still clenched in his hand, though he hadn't remembered taking it. At dawn, Mallory returned. "There's something you should see," he said grimly. They walked to the morgue. Sister Evangeline's body lay under a white sheet. The air smelled of formaldehyde and damp stone. Mallory pulled the cloth back just enough to reveal her face. The doctor had cleaned her, but her lips were still burned black, and there, etched faintly on her cheek, was a shape. Not a bruise, not a wound, a fingerprint. "Someone touched her as she died," Mallory said. "Pressed hard enough to leave an impression." Father Brown leaned closer. The ridges of the print were too defined, almost symmetrical, like carved glass, and at its center, a cross. "She wasn't touched by a person," he said slowly. "She was touched by something wearing one." Mallory stared. "What are you implying, Father?" But Father Brown's eyes were elsewhere, fixed on the mirror at the end of the corridor. In its reflection, Sister Evangeline stood upright, smiling again. He turned sharply. Nothing. When he looked back, the reflection was gone, but the mirror had fogged over. Words had appeared in the condensation. "She called you." He wiped them away with a shaking hand. But when he looked down, his fingers were stained black. The next evening, he returned to the chapel once more. He needed answers. He needed the truth, no matter how grotesque. The air was still, too still. Even the candles refused to burn. He placed the half-rosary on the altar beside the cracked crucifix. "Who whispered before she died?" he said softly. "To no one, and to everything." The silence answered him. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling him. He turned, but saw only shadows. "You're here," he said. "Aren't you?" The whisper came from behind him, cold and almost kind. "I never left." He spun around. The voice was unmistakable. Evangeline's. But she was there, only in pieces, light on marble, shape without form, a shimmer in the air that moved like breath. "What did you see?" he asked, heart thundering. She didn't answer, only tilted her head, as though listening. Then she whispered again, barely audible. "They're still praying." "Who?" Her eyes, if they were eyes, shifted toward the floor, beneath the altar. The same spot where the fire had scorched the stone. He knelt. The heat pulsed faintly through the marble, rhythmic, alive. He pried at the seam with the crucifix until it gave way. Beneath, a small cavity, blackened, filled with ash. He brushed it aside and found parchment, dozens of them, burned, brittle, confessions. He lifted one. The ink was written in two hands, the penitent's and the priest's, but the priest's name had been scratched out, all except one letter. B. His heart dropped. He flipped another. The same pattern, a confession of sin, followed by absolution. But every one ended the same way. "She heard me." He froze. The air in the chapel shifted. The candles flared to life on their own, flames burning black. And behind him, the whisper came again, soft, close, almost touching his ear. "She forgave you." He turned slowly. Sister Evangeline stood at the altar. Her hands were clasped, her eyes hollow. Smoke rose from her throat with every word. "She forgave you," she said again. But she didn't forgive herself. Father Brown took a step forward, trembling. "What do you want?" Her head tilted slightly. "To finish what she started." Then suddenly, her form flickered. For one brief second, he saw not a nun, but a man. His own face, mouth open, whispering. He fell backward, the crucifix clattering against the floor. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Only the rosary remained, lying where she had stood, its beads now whole. He picked it up with shaking hands. It was warm, alive. And when he held it to his ear, he heard her voice once more. "You were the last confession." His pulse stopped. He dropped the rosary, stumbling out into the rain. The wind howled through the chapel doors, extinguishing every candle at once. Mallory found him hours later, sitting on the steps, soaked and pale. "Father," he said cautiously, "the coroner's finished the report. You might want to see it." He handed him the paper. Cause of death, internal asphyxiation. Cause unknown. But it was the last line that chilled him most. Under witness statement, someone had scrawled, "Father Brown heard her last words." He hadn't told anyone that. He hadn't told a soul. He looked up. Mallory was staring at him oddly. "You all right, Father? You look like you've seen a ghost." Father Brown's voice was barely a whisper. "I think I've heard one." That night, unable to rest, he returned one final time to the chapel. The air smelled of wax and smoke. The altar gleamed with the reflection of the moon. He knelt where she had fallen. "Who whispered before you died?" he murmured. The whisper came again, softer than ever, rising through the floor like steam. "You did." He froze. The candles around him ignited one by one, forming a circle of light, and in the flicker of their flames, he saw his own shadow lean forward, closer to the altar, closer to the sound. Then the whisper turned to laughter, soft, female, familiar. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, dawn had broken. The church was empty. The rosary was gone. But carved into the altar, where she had fallen, were 5 words, burned deep into the marble. "Who whispered before she died?" He stared at it until the morning bells began to ring, each toll slower than the last. He pressed a trembling hand to the stone, whispering a single sentence that the walls seemed to absorb like confession. "I know who did it," he said quietly, "but the truth will never be told." And as he turned to leave, the final bell rang, followed by one last whisper, too faint for anyone else to hear. "Then I'll keep telling it." Chapter 6. The candle that lit betrayal. It wasn't the blood on the floor that terrified Father Brown. It was the candle still burning beside it, because it had been lit by a dead man's hand. The flame wavered weakly, refusing to die even as the storm outside screamed against the chapel windows. It burned with a strange hue, not gold, not white, but an amber so deep it seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat made of light. It illuminated everything around it. The overturned pews, the spilled ink on the confessional floor, the shadow of the man who had once begged for forgiveness only hours before. Inspector Mallory was the first to speak, his voice cracking against the thunder. "It's impossible," he muttered. "He was dead before we arrived." Father Brown didn't answer. He only stared at the flame, transfixed. The man who lay before them was not a stranger. It was Father Rourke, the parish priest of St. Dymphna's, a man Father Brown had once studied beside. His eyes were open, his mouth half-curled, as though whispering a final prayer that had turned to ash on his tongue. But it wasn't the sight of his old friend that chilled Father Brown to the marrow. It was the object gripped in Rourke's hand, a candle stub, burnt nearly to nothing, yet still glowing. Someone, or something, had made sure that light would not go out. The air smelled of wax and iron, sweet and metallic. The storm outside battered the stained glass windows, but inside, not a single breeze touched the flame. It stood unnaturally still. Father Brown crouched beside the body, his shadow swallowing the light. "He died kneeling," he said softly, as if in prayer. Mallory frowned. Praying for what? Father Brown didn't answer, because in that moment he saw something else. A faint trail of wax, leading away from the body, curling along the floorboards like a serpent. It wound its way toward the altar, where it disappeared beneath the cloth. He followed it slowly, his heart thudding with a dread he couldn't yet name. When he lifted the cloth, the smell hit him like a blow, burnt incense. And something else, something human. The wax trail ended at a second candle, unlit, untouched, but carved with words. Tiny Latin phrases etched into its surface in painstaking precision. He lifted it gently, reading the inscription aloud. Lux mendaci illuminabit veritatem. The light of lies will reveal truth. The flame behind him flickered, as though the words themselves had disturbed it. He turned and gasped. The candle Rourke had been holding was gone. Mallory swore under his breath, searching the shadows, but there was no sound, no footsteps, no movement. Only the faint scent of burning wax, now stronger, closer. It lingered near the walls, creeping like smoke without fire. Father Brown raised his lantern, eyes darting between the pews. "The flame moved," he murmured. "Not the wind, not the wick, the flame itself." And then from the far side of the chapel, the candles on the altar burst alight, one after another, as if an invisible hand were tracing its way toward them. Mallory stumbled backward. "What the devil?" Father Brown silenced him with a glance. His voice was low, calm, but his pulse betrayed him. "It's not the devil, Inspector. It's something much simpler." "Simpler?" He turned toward the altar. "A secret." The light shimmered, and in that glow, faint words began to appear on the wall, lines etched in soot, barely visible but unmistakable. "The candle reveals the liar." The message pulsed once, twice, then faded. By morning, word had spread. The churchyard was filled with whispers. Some said Father Rourke had called down a curse. Others swore they'd seen his ghost wandering the aisles, candle in hand. But Father Brown knew superstition rarely came without reason. He began to study Rourke's journals, hidden away in the vestry. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, until the final entry. There, the script faltered, letters jagged, written in haste. "Someone confesses falsehood. I will bring light. The flame will show what the tongue conceals." And below it, a single fingerprint pressed into wax. Father Brown leaned back, heart heavy. He believed the truth could be forced, he whispered. He believed confession could be compelled by light. That evening, he stood alone before the altar, the strange Latin candle in hand. The inscription shimmered faintly under his touch, though it hadn't been lit. He hesitated only a moment before striking the match. The flame caught instantly, too instantly. It roared to life, casting long shadows that crawled across the chapel walls. The air grew thick, choking. The flame bent sharply, pointing toward the confessional booth. He followed it. Inside the booth, the air was cold enough to frost his breath. The wooden screen trembled faintly, though no one sat on the other side. He knelt, clutching the candle. "Father Rourke," he whispered, "if you seek truth, reveal it." The flame danced wildly, flaring brighter. Then it dimmed, slowly, painfully, until only a faint blue ember remained. And in that faint light, carved into the inner wall of the confessional, he saw it. Names, dozens of them, each slashed through with a knife, and one not yet crossed out, his own. He stumbled backward, the candle flickering violently in his hand. The flame twisted, forming shapes that should have been impossible. Faces, mouths, eyes, all whispering one thing. You lied. He dropped the candle. It didn't go out. It rolled toward the booth's threshold, stopped, and began to melt. Fast. Too fast. The wax pooled at his feet, spreading in unnatural patterns, forming letters. Confess. He stared until the letters blurred, until the words seemed to pulse with breath. Then, darkness. The flame died, leaving only the faint heat on his skin. Mallory found him an hour later, pale and shaking, the candle reduced to nothing but soot. "What happened in there?" the inspector demanded. Father Brown could barely speak. Something was listening. Mallory frowned. Listening? To what? He swallowed hard. To the truth. They left the chapel sealed, but by the next night, someone had forced the lock. The caretaker found it open, the pews scattered, and every candle in the church burning. On the altar lay another note, written in ash. "The liar still walks." Mallory turned to him the next morning, face drawn. "What did you lie about, Father?" He didn't answer, because he wasn't sure himself. But that night, when he prayed, he remembered the last confession he'd ever taken from Father Rourke, months before his death. Rourke had wept as he spoke, trembling. "I can't tell them, Brown," he'd said. "I can't tell them what I saw beneath the chapel." Father Brown had sworn to silence him, to keep the seal of confession sacred, and now that oath felt like a noose around his soul. He returned to the church after midnight. The storm had passed, but the air still hummed with static, as if the world were holding its breath. The pews creaked under his steps. He reached the altar and froze. The bloodstain was gone. The wax trail gone. But the flame, oh, the flame burned again, right where Rourke had fallen. It bent toward him, almost bowing, and he understood. It wasn't trying to curse him. It was asking for help. He followed the trail of flickering light through the sacristy, down the narrow stairs, into the crypt. The air grew colder with every step. His candle fought to survive, but the darkness pressed against it, hungry. At the bottom, he found a stone slab he'd never seen before. It bore the same Latin as the candle, Lux mendaci illuminabit veritatem. He touched the inscription. The stone shifted slightly beneath his hand, revealing a hollow. Inside lay bones, human, and beside them, a small silver candlestick, its base inscribed with initials. F.R. Father Rourke. But there was something else. A second candlestick, identical, except its base bore different letters. G.B. Father Brown staggered backward. The candle flame quivered, shrank, and then flared higher, throwing light across the crypt wall. Words appeared there, written in soot, black and trembling. "You carried the second flame." He shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I didn't." But the flame answered him. It leaned forward, bending like a finger, pointing to the bones. Then the air shifted, and he heard it. Rourke's voice, calm, distant. Every light casts two shadows. The candle burst, flaring into brilliance so fierce he had to shield his eyes. When the light faded, the crypt was empty. No bones, no candlestick, only the single, still burning flame on the floor. He reached for it. The heat didn't burn. It pulsed beneath his palm like a living thing. And then it spoke, not aloud, inside him. Tell them the truth. He wanted to. God help him, he wanted to. But when he tried, no words came. Only a single thought repeated itself, relentless as prayer. "If I speak, I'll burn." He fled the crypt. Upstairs, dawn bled through the windows, painting the chapel in soft light. The candles had all burned out, except one, the same one, the betrayer's flame. He stared at it for a long time, until Mallory entered quietly behind him. "Father," he said, "they're saying Rourke's death wasn't murder after all. The coroner found traces of wax in his lungs. He suffocated." Father Brown turned slowly, his eyes dark and hollow. "No," he said softly. "He confessed." Mallory frowned. "To what?" Father Brown's gaze drifted to the flickering flame, to lighting the wrong candle. He turned back to the altar, whispering under his breath, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Mallory left him there, shaking his head. But long after the inspector had gone, the candle still burned, casting a light that refused to die. And if you looked close enough, in that faint amber glow, you could almost see two figures kneeling side by side, one living, one not, both whispering the same prayer. "Forgive me for what I lit." Chapter 7. He vanished after midnight mass. He stepped into the chapel at midnight, and by morning, every trace of him was gone, except for the blood-soaked cassock, folded neatly on the altar. The man's name was Brother Callum. Quiet, devout, the kind of priest who never drew attention, never raised his voice. He lived in a small room behind the choir loft, spent his days transcribing psalms by hand, and his nights walking the perimeter of the chapel in silence. He didn't speak of his past, but everyone knew he had once served in Rome. Some whispered of exorcisms, others of secrets buried so deep the church forgot where it hid them. But Callum never spoke of it, until the night of midnight mass. The Christmas Eve service had been unusually crowded. Candles shimmered along the stained glass windows. Snow tapped gently against the roof. Father Brown had noticed Callum acting strangely even before the first hymn. His eyes darted toward the crucifix more often than usual, and when he recited the gospel, his voice faltered. Only once, but enough. Enough that the choir stopped singing for half a second longer than necessary. After the final blessing, Father Brown watched Callum walk alone toward the sacristy, head bowed. The air had grown colder by then, unnaturally so. The candles flickered. The bells above did not ring. By sunrise, Brother Callum had vanished. No one had seen him leave. His bed was untouched, his boots dry. But on the altar, draped over the linen cloth, was his cassock, folded perfectly, too perfectly, and soaked in blood. Not fresh, not dry, but ancient, rust-dark, clotted in the corners, enough to drown a man. Mallory was called. The chapel was sealed. The blood was tested. It wasn't Callum's. Father Brown said nothing at first. He simply stood before the altar, eyes locked on the folded garment. He knew what it meant, and he knew what it demanded. Silence. But silence was no longer safe. That night, the candles in the nave refused to stay lit. Every time they were struck, the flame would sputter and vanish, until one, only one, caught fire. A tall, waxen taper. One that hadn't been lit during Mass. One no one remembered placing. It burned blue, and it hissed, as if whispering. Father Brown leaned close, listened, and in the flicker of that impossible flame, he heard it. He didn't vanish, he returned. The whisper came from beneath the altar. He dropped the taper. Mallory searched the church grounds for 2 days. Dogs were brought in. They wouldn't go near the sanctuary. One growled. The other collapsed. By the third night, no one would enter the chapel alone. But Father Brown did. He stood in the pulpit where Brother Callum had last read the gospel. The book was still open, but the words had changed. Where once was John 1:14, now there was only one line. and the word became lost. He flipped the page, blank, another, blank. Then, at the center of the gospel, etched between the parchment fibers, a single drop of blood, still wet. He reached for it, and the wind howled through the chapel doors, slamming them shut. The candles all died, except one, the blue flame, still burning, still whispering. He took it, let it guide him. It bent toward the choir loft, up the stairs, into Callum's room. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, all was as it had been, except for the mirror above the desk. It was covered in frost. From the inside, he wiped it with his sleeve. There was no reflection, only darkness, and in that darkness, movement. A figure, hooded, kneeling, bleeding. He stepped back, but the figure stepped forward, toward the glass. The frost spread again, and written into it were 3 words. You left him. Father Brown's hands trembled. He dropped the candle. It didn't fall. It hung mid-air, hovering inches above the floor, flame frozen, like time had broken. Then it blinked out. The room fell into shadow. He fled. By morning, the cassock was gone, but where it had lain, carved into the altar, were the words, "This is not betrayal. This is return." The townspeople said Father Brown had gone pale as death, that he walked as if the earth were tilted, because he remembered what Brother Callum had said to him once, years ago after Rome. "If I ever disappear," he'd whispered, "I didn't leave, I was claimed." And now something had claimed him. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. The bell tower rang at 3:13 each night, though the ropes had been removed. The font filled itself with wine, and every crucifix in the church had turned upside down. They fixed them, they turned them back. But the next night, they were reversed again. Then the letters came, delivered with no name, no address, just parchment, wax sealed, each one bearing a message. The first, the altar is a door. The second, the gospel hides a name. The third, he is not alone. Father Brown read them in silence. He didn't tell Mallory, he didn't tell the bishop, but he knew. He remembered Rome, he remembered the hidden records, the whispers of a brotherhood that never took vows, only oaths, and he remembered Callum's greatest fear. What if God stopped listening and something else started? On the 7th day, the pews began to bleed. No one saw it begin. No one admitted they saw it drip. But the red trails curled down the wood like veins, pooling on the cold stone floor. And in the center of the pool, left by some unseen hand, a key, old, bronze, shaped like a cross. He took it, knew where it fit. The sacristy had a door, locked since 1847. The bishop claimed it led to a bricked-over storeroom. The key turned. The bricks were gone. He descended into the dark. Stone stairs, mold, bones, and at the bottom, light, not fire, not candle. Something else, something that pulsed with memory. And in that light, Callum, or what remained. Not a body, not quite. A figure, wrapped in linen, arms crossed, eyes open, mouth sewn shut, but breathing, and carved into the wall above him, a single phrase, "Let not the silence speak." Father Brown fell to his knees, because it already had. He stood, reached for Callum's hand. It was warm, and in the stillness, he heard it. A prayer, not in Latin, in a language that had no words, only shapes, only memory. He fled, sealed the door, burned the key, and when Mallory asked what he'd found, he only said, he didn't vanish after midnight mass. He entered it. Mallory frowned. Entered what? Father Brown didn't answer, because even now, as he knelt in prayer, he heard the bells ringing once more. 3:13, and somewhere beneath the chapel, something whispered his name, not to curse him, but to welcome him home. And still, in the echo of each bell, the question remained, was Callum taken by something holy? Or did he finally answer a call the church had long forgotten to fear? Father Brown rose, his voice a breath. "I know who did it," he whispered, "but the truth will never be told. Because sometimes the faithful do not fall, they follow, even if they must vanish to do it." Chapter 8. No footprints led to body. They found her body in the snow, but not a single footprint led to it, not even her own. The girl's name was Clara, 18, a choir singer, soft-spoken, her voice the only thing bright enough to fill the hollow winter nights in Kembleford. And now she lay beneath the bell tower, eyes wide open toward the heavens she had sung about the night before. The frost around her shimmered blue, untouched, unbroken. No path, no struggle, no sign of entry or escape. Just a perfect circle of snow and silence, as though the world itself had exhaled and left her there. The constable was the first to notice the impossibility. "No prints," he murmured, shaking his head. "Not hers, not anyone's. It's like she fell from the sky." Father Brown said nothing. He only stared at her face, serene, almost peaceful, and the way her hands were crossed, clutching a single white candle that hadn't burned down at all. A candle that should have melted in her grip. Mallory knelt beside the body. "If it's murder, it's the cleverest one I've seen," he said, his breath curling into the frozen air. "And if it isn't, then I don't want to know what it is." But Father Brown wanted to know. He had to, because just the night before, Clara had stood in that same courtyard, singing her solo during the midnight benediction. And when she finished, she'd turned toward him, eyes gleaming strangely, and whispered, "It'll be over by morning." He hadn't asked what she meant. Now he wished he had. The church bells tolled faintly through the mist, each note cracking like old glass. The villagers gathered in the distance, watching silently as the doctor examined the body. "No wounds," he said at last. "No signs of struggle, no frostbite even. She's cold, yes, but not frozen. Heart simply stopped." Mallory scoffed. "Hearts don't simply stop, Doctor." But sometimes they did, Father Brown thought, especially when faith was involved, especially when something older than fear was watching. He stepped closer to the girl's hand, careful not to disturb the snow. The candle she held was etched with strange markings, small, precise grooves running around its base like a code. He'd seen such marks before, years ago, in a monastery deep in the Italian Alps. They called them the Dead Prayers, ritual carvings said to burn the names of the damned. But those candles had all been destroyed centuries ago. Or so he thought. He leaned closer. One line of the etching stood out, cleaner than the rest, as though freshly cut. "Lux non venit hoc. Light does not come here." His heart stilled. That evening the body was taken to the rectory, placed upon the marble table beneath a sheet. Mallory ordered the area closed, but the sisters refused to leave the chapel. They prayed through the night, their voices trembling. By dawn, the candles around the altar had all extinguished themselves, except one, the white candle from Clara's hand. It burned in the same place where her body had been found, and the wax did not drip. When Father Brown entered the chapel at first light, the air was dense with the smell of salt and ash. He stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping forward. The candle's flame flared as he neared, as if sensing him. He reached out, and the flame bent toward him, whispering faintly, like breath. He froze, because the sound it made wasn't random. It was words, a single word, his name. He dropped his hand, backing away, his pulse hammering in his throat. The whisper continued, low and deliberate, weaving between the flickers. "Father, you were there." He stumbled back. The chapel blurred around him, and for a moment, just one unbearable second, he saw something moving in the reflection of the candle's glass casing. Not his face. Hers. Clara. Her lips were moving, but not in prayer. By noon, the flame had gone out on its own. Yet when he touched the candle, it was still warm. He carried it to his quarters, placed it on his desk, and stared at it until the shadows lengthened. Mallory stopped by once, exasperated. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Father Brown replied quietly. "Or maybe the ghost saw me first." The inspector frowned. "You're not making sense." He didn't need to, because sense was no longer part of it. When Mallory left, the wind rose, rattling the chapel doors. Father Brown watched the candle flicker, unlit yet alive. Then suddenly, the flame reignited on its own. No match, no spark, just ignition. And with it, a scent. Not wax, not incense. Blood. He staggered backward, covering his mouth. The candle burned brighter, casting shapes on the wall. Shadows that didn't belong to him. They moved independently, shifting like dancers in a rhythm only they could hear. Then he saw it. Footprints. Forming in the light. One by one, they appeared across the wooden floor. But not toward the candle. Away from it. Leading to the door. He followed. Slowly. Each step the prints sank deeper into the wood, as though whoever, or whatever, was walking left no mark on the world, only its reflection. The prints stopped before the chapel door, and there, etched into the floorboards, were words burned by heat. The light followed her home. He felt something cold brush his shoulder then. He turned sharply. No one. The candle had gone out again, but the scent remained. The next morning, the villagers gathered by the frozen river. Someone had seen something, or claimed they had. A figure walking across the ice long before dawn. Barefoot, cloaked, carrying a candle. They followed the trail to the center of the river, where the ice thinned to glass, and there, floating beneath it, face pale and perfect, was Clara. Again. Father Brown arrived just as they pulled her up. Mallory cursed under his breath. "We buried her last night," the doctor stammered. I identified the body myself." She looked the same. Same dress, same candle in her hand. No footprints. The priest crossed himself. "She's trying to tell us something," he whispered. Mallory glared at him. "She's dead. Twice over." Father Brown didn't reply. He simply knelt beside her, touched her wrist, and felt it. Warm. Not body heat. Something else. When they brought her back to the rectory, the air inside grew cold. The candle she held wouldn't go out, not even when submerged in holy water. That night, Father Brown sat beside the body. The flickering light painted the ceiling with strange, shifting patterns. And as the hours passed, exhaustion overtook him. He awoke to darkness. The candle was gone. So was the body. He stood quickly, searching. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, but the floor, there, a single wet footprint, bare. He followed it, down the hall, through the nave, past the altar. It stopped before the confessional booth. He opened the door. The candle was inside, still burning, and on the opposite seat, his own Bible, open. But the page had changed, every word blackened, except one line, "Forgive me, for I returned the light." He sank into the booth, trembling. "Clara," he whispered, "what did you see?" The candle sputtered. The flame split into two, forming the shape of an eye. "You," it seemed to say. He stumbled out, clutching the cross at his throat. The church was alive with whispers now, soft, endless, echoing from every shadow. You, you, you. When dawn came, Mallory found him kneeling before the altar, the candle gone, the floor scorched. "What happened here?" he demanded. Father Brown looked up slowly. His voice was barely a whisper. "She didn't fall from the sky." "Then how?" He turned his gaze toward the stained glass window above the altar. The morning sun shone through the glass, casting 1,000 shards of color onto the floor. And in the center of it all, the red pane depicting the Nativity was cracked. Behind it, faintly visible, was a shape pressed against the glass from the outside. A hand, small, pale, frozen. Mallory climbed the ladder to investigate. The hand was real, flesh and bone beneath the ice, but the wall outside the window had no ledge, no foothold, nothing that could support a body. And yet, the hand was inside the glass, embedded. Father Brown stared. "She didn't walk here," he murmured. "She was taken by what she worshipped." Mallory turned. "What are you saying?" But Father Brown only closed his eyes, whispering a prayer so quietly even God might not have heard it. That evening, when they sealed the chapel, a storm rolled over the valley. The wind screamed through the tower, and the bell rang by itself. At midnight, the caretaker swore he saw a light moving along the pews, a candle flame, drifting, searching. By dawn, it was gone. But when Father Brown entered to pray, he found something resting on the altar again. The candle, burned down to its final inch, and beside it, carved deep into the wood, were the words, "No footprints led to body." He stared at them for a long time. The wind outside whispered like a voice just beyond hearing, repeating the phrase over and over until it didn't sound like a sentence anymore, but a warning. No footprints, no path, no escape. He placed a trembling hand on the altar and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Then he blew out the last of the candle, and in the silence that followed, another flame sparked to life. Behind him, somewhere no footsteps had ever walked. Chapter 9. Father Brown entered alone. Again, the doors of the chapel were chained shut from the outside, but somehow Father Brown was already kneeling at the altar, again. The constable swore he'd locked the chapel before sundown. Inspector Mallory had the only key, and no one had touched it. The windows were sealed. The bell tower had been boarded since the last disappearance. And yet, just as the bells struck midnight, the candles inside flared to life one by one. And there he was, alone, silent, praying in the dark. But he had not entered through any door, and when they finally broke the chains and entered, he was gone. Only the imprint of his knees on the stone remained. This was the third time it had happened. The first time was 2 months ago, after the death of Sister Agnes. They'd found Father Brown at the altar long before anyone had arrived to unlock the church. He'd claimed not to remember entering, claimed he had no memory of prayer, only waking in darkness. The second time was last week, after the girl in the snow. The priest had vanished from his quarters sometime after midnight. Mallory, already on edge, had ordered a search of the grounds. They found him asleep on the sanctuary floor, hands clasped, whispering something in Latin that no one recognized. Now it had happened again, and this time the altar had changed. The candles burned black, their flames without heat. The crucifix was turned upside down, yet no one admitted moving it. And carved into the altar slab, with delicate precision, were the words, "He keeps returning because he's still waiting." Mallory cornered Father Brown the next day, demanding answers. But the priest only said, "I was called." By whom? He looked away. Not whom, what. The chapel was closed after that, officially condemned. Too many accidents, too many deaths. But the villagers still gathered outside on Sunday mornings, their prayers rising into the mist like smoke. And every night, the candles re-lit themselves. Father Brown refused to leave the grounds. He stayed in the rectory, pacing its halls in silence, stopping often to stare at the church through his window. He kept a candle burning in his room at all times, always the same one, tall, thin, the wax the color of dried bone. He didn't sleep much, and when he did, he mumbled in his dreams. Words no one understood. Words no one wanted to understand. Then came the letter, handwritten, delivered with no name. The paper folded perfectly, the wax seal pressed with a sign Mallory didn't recognize, but Father Brown did. He recognized it from the day the old bishop died, clawing at his throat, crying about a door beneath the altar that was never supposed to open. He opened the letter slowly. Inside were 4 words. You brought it back. Father Brown did not flinch, did not blink. He folded the letter and tucked it into his Bible. That night, he entered the chapel again. And again the doors had not opened. This time, something else waited at the altar. A new candle, one no one had ever seen before, short, wide, bound in twine and dried petals. It burned with a red flame, like blood on fire. The next morning, when Mallory forced open the doors, the candle was gone, but the smell remained. Not wax, not ash, lilies, and old stone. Father Brown stood at the back of the chapel, pale and shaking. He didn't speak, only watched the shadows move across the pews, like they remembered something he had forgotten. Mallory pulled him aside. You need to stop going in there. The priest smiled faintly. I never try to. The inspector's voice broke. What do you mean? Father Brown's voice was quieter than wind. I think it invites me, when it's ready. The chapel was empty that evening, but the organ began to play. No one was there, no sheet music, just the same 4 notes, over and over again. The notes to the hymn Clara had sung the night she died. That night, Father Brown sat at his desk and opened the Bible. The letter was gone. In its place was another note, different handwriting, still unsigned. He returns to finish what you started. He stared at the words until they began to blur. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He went into the confessional, and he sat on the side meant for the penitent, and waited. He waited until the candle beside him went out. Then he heard breathing, not his own, from the other side of the screen, and a voice. Do you remember the first one? He couldn't speak. Because I do. He tried to rise, but his limbs didn't move. The screen between them shimmered faintly, like it wasn't solid. Then, just for a moment, he saw an eye watching him through it. Burning red, alive. And it whispered again. You opened the door the night you forgave him. That's when I entered. He fainted. When he awoke, he was kneeling at the altar again, alone. Mallory found him an hour later. The inspector didn't ask questions this time. He just helped him up, quietly. The chapel smelled like lilies, again, and the walls were warm to the touch. The last time it happened, the doors were nailed shut, iron rods across the frame, bolts welded, chains rusted and solid. But at midnight, the bells rang anyway, and inside, the candles lit, and someone whispered a hymn only Father Brown had ever known. The inspector didn't try to enter this time. He simply watched through the stained glass, and he saw the priest kneeling, and something kneeling across from him. Not a man, not a shape, but a shadow, and it moved, mirrored him, smiled. When the morning came, Father Brown emerged. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands burned, but he said only one thing: "I was never alone." That day, he wrote a letter to no one. He placed it on the altar beside the last unburnt candle, and he left the chapel one final time. Mallory asked him that evening, "Will it stop?" Father Brown looked up at the night sky. "No," he said, "it's only begun." Mallory lit a cigarette with trembling hands. "Do you even know what it is?" The priest didn't answer at first. Then quietly, "It's what we let in when we forget why we're here." Inspector stared at him. "And you? Why are you here, Father?" Brown smiled, hollow and tired. "To keep going in alone, so no one else has to." That night the villagers reported music again, faint organ notes, weeping, and then silence. When they opened the chapel the next morning, Father Brown was gone. His Bible was on the altar, the candle was out, and in its wax was the imprint of a hand, too long, too sharp, not human. No one saw him again. But each night, when the clock struck 12, the chapel lit itself, and from the altar came the sound of footsteps, one pair, then another, mirroring each other, always together, forever alone. And carved into the floor now, beneath where Father Brown once knelt, are 6 words burned into the stone. Father Brown entered alone. Again. But no one knows if he ever left, or if something else wears his shadow now. And if you ask the villagers what they believe, they'll only whisper, "I know who did it," but the truth will never be told, because whatever was waiting inside that chapel, Father Brown welcomed it, and it never let go. Chapter 10. The choir boy lied under oath. He swore to God he hadn't seen anything, yet the body was found beneath his bed. The choir boy's name was Thomas, 12 years old, bright voice, brighter smile, the kind of boy people trusted without question, too innocent, too small, too pure. But there are things small voices aren't meant to carry, and on that frozen morning in Kembleford, when they pulled the choir boy from his quarters, pale and shaking, that smile was nowhere to be found. The body beneath his bed wasn't fresh. It had been there for days, folded carefully, arms crossed, lips stitched shut with what looked like choir thread, the same white and gold silk used for the altar banners. The boy's room smelled not of rot, but of incense. Frankincense, too much of it, thick, sweet, and still burning in the censer on his desk. Inspector Mallory asked the boy 3 times if he'd seen anyone come or go. Thomas's voice never wavered. "No, sir?" He asked again if he'd heard anything strange at night. "Only prayers, sir." And then he asked, very gently, if he'd moved the body. The boy hesitated, only for a breath, but Father Brown caught it. "Thomas," he said softly, "you're not in trouble. Not if you tell the truth." The boy looked at him with wide eyes and said nothing. He lied. The next day, the coroner identified the body as Father Carrow, a visiting priest who'd vanished nearly a week before. The same man who had taken Thomas's confession the night he disappeared. There was no blood, no bruising, no signs of struggle, only the stitching and the wax. Wax had been poured into the body's ears, as if to keep something out, or in. Mallory ordered the boy held at the rectory, not as a suspect, but for protection. Whatever had happened, someone wanted silence. But as the inspector turned to leave, Thomas reached out suddenly and grabbed Father Brown's hand. "He told me not to say," he whispered. "Who?" The boy looked down. "He wears robes, but he's not a priest." That night, Thomas was moved to a locked room beside the chapel, a guard stationed at the door. But at midnight, The guard fell asleep. And when he woke, the room was empty. The boy was gone. Only the stitching remained, laid carefully on the bed in the shape of a cross. Father Brown found it first. He didn't call Mallory. He didn't raise an alarm. He just knelt beside the bed, picked up the thread, and whispered, "You lied to protect him, but he was never going to protect you." The chapel bells rang once, then again, then went silent. By morning, Thomas had returned. He was found asleep in the pews, hands clasped, whispering a hymn that hadn't been sung in decades, the same one Father Caro had hummed the day before he vanished. Mallory wanted answers. He demanded them, but the boy didn't speak, didn't blink. Only when Father Brown entered the chapel alone did the boy look up and said, "He hears through the walls." They searched the chapel, found nothing. But when they tapped the paneling behind the altar, the wood sounded hollow. Mallory pried it open. Inside, a narrow corridor, dustless, cold. At the end of it, a door. And behind the door, nothing, only silence and wax, melted, pooled, shaped like ears pressed against stone. On the floor, a single slip of parchment. "Speak, and he listens." Mallory shook his head. "What in God's name is this?" Father Brown didn't answer, because he remembered a story from Rome, a legend of a priest who demanded silence during confession so sacred, so absolute, that he cut out his own tongue to ensure he'd never speak what he heard. They said his soul remained in the walls of any chapel he entered, waiting for someone to speak the words that would bring him back, someone like a child, someone who didn't know better, someone like Thomas. That night, Father Brown entered the confessional, sat where Father Caro had sat. The screen creaked as it closed. He waited. For an hour. 2. Then a breath, not his own. Then laughter, soft, childlike but cruel, and a whisper. "He lied because I told him to." Father Brown gripped the crucifix. "Who are you?" The laughter stopped. "I am the one who listens." He rose, pushed open the door. No one was there, except the boy, standing at the altar, eyes wide, voice flat. "You said you'd protect me." Father Brown stepped forward. "I am trying to." "You're too late." Then he opened his mouth, and wax poured out, hot, searing. It spilled onto the stone floor, curling into words. The choir boy lied under oath. Then he collapsed. They rushed him to the infirmary. The doctor said the burns were real. The wax came from inside his throat. Mallory paced the rectory. "What in hell is going on, Father?" Brown didn't answer. He returned to the chapel, alone. The confessionals were gone, removed, the choir loft dismantled. But the walls still whispered. At midnight, the organ played, the same 4 notes, again and again. And behind the altar, where the hollow had been, a new candle burned, short, thick, shaped like an ear. Its flame whispered, "I know who did it." Father Brown stepped back. "I don't want to know," he whispered. The flame replied, "You already do." In the morning, Thomas was gone, vanished. No doors opened, no windows broken, only silence, only the stitching, now wrapped around Father Brown's Bible, and one final note beneath it. Confession was never supposed to be safe. He stood at the altar that night, alone, lit a candle, and whispered, "I know who did it." The shadows leaned closer. "But the truth," he said, "will never be told." And from the walls, something smiled. Chapter 11. A Holy Man's Unholy Secret. He died with a rosary in one hand and a butcher's hook in the other. They found him kneeling by the altar, face serene as though lost in prayer. But his other hand, cold and blood-slick, still gripped the metal as if repentance had never arrived in time. Father Anselm was beloved by all, a healer of souls, a quiet man. But in death, he wore a look too calm for the horror sprawled before him. The congregation gasped, the constables whispered, and Father Brown simply closed his eyes. What secret does a man carry so tightly to his chest that even God must knock twice to be let in? The church smelled of old incense and something metallic beneath, the heavy scent of candle wax mixed with a deeper, iron tang that didn't belong in holy places. Behind the altar, hidden in a small sacristy where vestments once hung, they found something no man was meant to see, a box of letters, burned at the edges, written by trembling hands, signed with names no one recognized until they did. But none of it made sense, because the choir boy who discovered the body, Stephen, claimed Father Anselm had been alone when he locked the vestry. No visitors, no strange sounds, just the slow ticking of the old chapel clock. Yet Father Brown, as he stepped into the chapel, glanced once at the statue of St. Jude and said softly, he wasn't alone, and he never prayed that night. What happened inside that chapel was no ordinary confession gone wrong. The wounds on the corpse did not match the timeline. Blood had dried too slowly, the bruising too fresh for a man supposedly killed the night before. Someone wanted the scene to look pious, peaceful. But death, real death, is never neat. The problem wasn't who killed Father Anselm. The problem was that no one should have wanted to. He was kind, generous. He paid for orphaned girls to study abroad. He fed the poor. He refused the bishopric 3 times, choosing instead to remain in the poorest parish in England. But behind every smile, there was something too perfect, too consistent, as if his entire life had been rehearsed. Father Brown found the second hook buried beneath the woodpile behind the rectory, wrapped in a child's drawing, a wolf and a man, and a tiny cross on the man's chest. But the figure of the man had no face. Stephen had drawn it. And when Father Brown asked him quietly what it meant, the boy only said, he wasn't supposed to open the cellar. That's where the singing came from. But he did, and the singing stopped. That's when the constables stopped looking for a murderer, because the last thing anyone wanted to believe was that the holy man, the parish's backbone, had unlocked a door meant to stay closed. But Father Brown knew the worst lies were never shouted. They were whispered through stained glass, embroidered into sermons, polished into virtue. And when he touched the child's drawing again, he noticed something else, hidden beneath the crayon, in pencil first. A name, one that hadn't been spoken aloud in decades. When Father Brown brought that name to the bishop, the man turned pale, not with guilt, but with fear. What cellar? He asked. There isn't one, Father Brown replied, but there was, dug beneath the chapel, behind a false wall, the kind of place built for silence. And whatever happened down there, it wasn't prayer. The first big reveal came when the autopsy noted rope burns, not fresh, but old, scarred into Father Anselm's wrists, healed over years. He had once been tied, repeatedly, not recently, but long ago. A man who had lived through his own darkness, perhaps, and kept it with him. The letters spoke of the order, not the church, not the law, but something else. And the signatures, all aliases, until one was matched to a missing boy, last seen in 1987. A boy who'd vanished from this very town. The drawing had been a warning, not a memory. And the question that tore Father Brown in two was this. Had Anselm been a victim of something deeper, or its protector? You see, Anselm's kindness wasn't false. That much was true. But kindness can be a mask worn by those who need it most. Father Brown began to suspect that Anselm hadn't been killed for what he'd done, but for what he refused to continue doing, because the box of letters wasn't hidden. It was placed, carefully, and the last one, unsigned, was addressed to the one who will break the chain. That chain had a name. Father Brown never told the bishop. He never told the constables. But he told Stephen, "You were right." He opened the cellar, and someone sang no more. At the funeral, every priest wept. The bishop's hands trembled during the blessing. And when the procession moved toward the graveyard, a single man remained in the pew, watching. Not crying, not praying, just watching. Father Brown sat beside him. The man smelled, faintly, of ash and winter wind. "Is it over?" the man asked. "No," Father Brown said, with that half-smile that never reached his eyes. "It never is." When the coffin was lowered, birds scattered from the trees, the sun dimmed behind a low-hanging cloud, and the wind that passed through the churchyard whispered like breath over bone. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel, alone. Beneath the old wooden cross, he placed the child's drawing where the altar cloth met the stone. He lit a single candle, and then from the shadows, a voice spoke. "I told the truth." Father Brown didn't turn. "So did he." The voice cracked. "But I thought saints didn't bleed." Father Brown finally turned, eyes dark and steady. "Saints bleed the most." And when the candle flickered, the wind died, and the church fell into silence again. He left the drawing behind, the crayon image of a man without a face, because some truths are not solved, only survived. And when the choir returned the next morning, they found that drawing tucked behind the hymnal, alongside a note in the priest's handwriting. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. She knelt, then slit throats. She knelt before the altar in silence, head bowed, palms raised, eyes weeping, and then, with the same hands that once fed the poor and stitched the choir boy's robe, she slit 3 throats before the candles could flicker out. It was supposed to be a vigil, a quiet hour of mourning for a lost sister. Instead, the vicarage doors were bolted from the inside, and every lock turned with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. The first body discovered was not her sister's. It was Father Lenham, the old priest who had baptized her. His throat was opened in a clean line, laid neatly across the altar linen like a sacrificial lamb. The second was the organist, hand still frozen mid-note, his fingers bloodied against the keys as if trying to finish one final hymn. The third was someone no one even recognized, a man in priest's vestments, his collar burned, his eyes pried open, and beside them all, candlelight catching the crimson trail on her sleeves, she knelt, whispering Latin that not even the bishop could place. By morning, the village was wrapped in a silence so thick it suffocated. No one came forward. No one asked. And when Father Brown arrived, summoned by a letter that simply read, "You must see her kneel," even he hesitated before crossing the threshold. The door creaked open by itself. No police, no witnesses, just the air that carried a scent older than blood and wax. Something cold, something rotten. She was still there, kneeling, still whispering. And when she finally looked up at him, her face bore the expression of someone who had seen the other side of heaven and come back furious. They called it a mass killing, a religious hysteria. They said grief does strange things to the mind. But Father Brown, who had seen true madness and true grace, knew better. The knife was ceremonial. The Latin was not a prayer. And the stranger's collar, it wasn't burned. It was branded. She spoke only once during the first interrogation. They gave her to the man in the mask, and you let them. Then silence. The bishop refused to cooperate with the investigation. The archives were sealed. No one remembered a girl named Celestine. No one could confirm if the kneeling woman ever had a sister. And yet, the church registry held one line scratched into the page with a different ink in the margin of an unrelated baptism record. Celestine, born of no mother, taken beneath the bell tower. Father Brown's hands trembled as he touched the page. The ink felt fresh, though the record was dated 37 years ago. He knew something was wrong. Not merely wrong, designed, constructed. A memory shaped like a weapon. He asked the bishop directly, who was Celestine? The bishop replied with a warning, some saints burn to prove their worth. Others were always flames. Every attempt to trace the woman's identity failed. Hospital records vanished. The choir roster from 5 years ago, gone. Even the CCTV footage from that night had audio, but no visual. You could hear the gasps, the singing, the sound of blood hitting stone, but the screen remained dark, as if the church itself refused to show what it had seen. And still, she knelt, every evening at the same hour, same posture, same chant. They moved her to a holding cell, and she scratched a perfect circle on the wall with her fingernail, over and over, until her fingers bled. When they painted over it, it reappeared. When they removed the brick, it returned on the next one, a perfect bleeding circle, a wound that kept opening. A week later, the bishop vanished. No note, no luggage, just a single item left on his desk, a photograph, black and white, a girl with a wolf carved into her shoulder blade, kneeling beside the altar. The timestamp read 1914. Father Brown's breath caught, not because of the girl, but because the priest in the corner of the photo, the one placing the holy book on the altar, was himself. Impossible. He was born in 1952. He took the photo to the diocesan archives. The clerk's hands shook as he turned it over. "This is the first photo ever taken in this parish," the man whispered. The camera was built into the altar's frame by the founder himself. A timer captured one image every year during Lent. And yet there it was, Father Brown, in 1914, placing the book on the altar beside a kneeling girl who would one day slit throats and whisper names that burned through paint and stone. He asked the kneeling woman directly, "Why am I in that photograph?" She only blinked, and for the first time, she smiled, not with joy, with pity. "You forgot again." The ground beneath his feet no longer felt steady. His past didn't feel like his memories blurred at the edges. He remembered a funeral that never happened, a name on a bell tower he had never seen, a prayer that ended with, "Forgive us for burying the fire." He returned to the vicarage where it all began, empty, stripped, not a trace of blood or wax or anything at all, except one thing. Behind the altar, nailed into the wood, a single card that read, "You made me kneel. Now they kneel for me." He stared at it for hours. He thought of the photo. He thought of the stranger with the branded collar and the organist's hand still frozen in song. He thought of how a girl can disappear from every record, every memory, and still live inside the shape of a prayer. He thought of the fire inside her voice. He thought of how it sounded like his own. Then he whispered something no one heard, turned, and walked out into the snow, never to return to that church again. And still, in the cell, she kneels, every evening, and if you listen close, you'll hear her say his name. Not once, but as if she said it forever. And Father Brown, he knows. He knows the truth. But when asked, he only replies, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told.